December 1942, Detroit, Michigan. The air inside the Chrysler tank arsenal is thick with smoke, oil, and heat. Men in heavy gloves move through the chaos. Sparks fly, steel plates crash, engines roar. On the assembly line, a new shape is born every few minutes, the M4 Sherman. In the center of the factory floor, foremen shout over the noise. Trains wait outside, their flatbeds already loaded with tanks that gleam under the dim lights. Each one a promise to a world at war. Thousands of miles away, in the frozen fields outside Stalingrad and the burning sands of North Africa, German tanks dominate the battlefield, heavier, stronger, deadlier. But in America's industrial heart, a different kind of weapon is being forged, not a tank made of steel, but an idea that production itself could win a war. The tide of the Second World War would not turn on the battlefield first. It would turn in the factories. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, its army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. It had fewer than 400,000 men, a handful of modern aircraft, and tank designs that were already considered obsolete by European standards. The world watched the lightning war unfold across Europe. Poland crushed in weeks, France defeated in 6. German panzer divisions, sleek and efficient, cut through enemy lines like blades through paper. The myth of German invincibility was born in these years, fueled by the speed, coordination, and precision of their war machine. But that same machine had limits that the Germans refused to see. Their factories were advanced but small. Their designs were intricate but slow to produce. Every Tiger or Panther tank that rolled out of a German plant demanded weeks of skilled labor, precision machining, and rare materials. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. was waking up. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy, a phrase that would soon define not only American industry, but the outcome of the war itself. Before Pearl Harbor, many American factories built cars, farm machinery, and household appliances. But once war came, the conversion was total. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors stopped producing civilian vehicles. Their engineers retooled assembly lines overnight. Welding car frames became tank hulls, dashboard assembly became turret fitting, and conveyor belts moved not sedans but armored beasts bound for Europe. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit, completed in 1941, became the centerpiece of this transformation. Designed by engineer K.T. Keller and architect Albert Kahn, it was the largest single-purpose factory in the world, a mile long, built from concrete and steel, operating 24 hours a day. In its first full year, the plant produced over 22,000 tanks, more than all German factories combined could manage in the same period. The Germans didn't believe it at first. How could a nation that had never faced blitzkrieg build an army faster than the Reich itself? Part of the answer lay in American industrial philosophy: quantity over complexity, reliability over perfection. Where the Germans built masterpieces, the Americans built workhorses. The M4 Sherman wasn't the heaviest tank, nor the most armored, nor the most powerful, but it could be built fast, repaired easily, and produced in numbers that overwhelmed the battlefield. Each Sherman used standardized parts, interchangeable components, and simplified systems. If a gearbox failed in North Africa, a replacement could come from a plant in Ohio and fit perfectly. No adjustments needed. This standardization, combined with mass assembly techniques pioneered by Henry Ford decades earlier, allowed U.S. factories to achieve what military planners once thought impossible: a tank every 49 minutes. Meanwhile, German production remained fragmented. Factories were bombed, supply chains stretched thin, and internal rivalries slowed innovation. Each new design, the Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, demanded new tools, new parts, new logistics. Every improvement added complexity, not speed. By mid-1943, the numbers told the story. The U.S. had built more tanks in 6 months than Germany had since the war began, and that difference, though invisible on the battlefield at first, would soon shape every major engagement to come. Because war, at its core, is not only fought by soldiers, it's fought by those who can keep the steel flowing. By 1942, American industrial output was becoming a force of its own. Every city with factories, every town with skilled labor, contributed to an unprecedented war effort. It was not just tanks, Planes, trucks, ships, and artillery rolled off assembly lines in numbers no enemy could match. The air war exemplified this transformation. Factories in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and California produced thousands of B-17 Flying Fortresses and P-51 Mustangs, aircraft capable of sustaining long-range daylight operations over Europe. Each bomber required hundreds of skilled workers, tens of thousands of components, and months of coordinated assembly. Yet the Americans managed to scale production to levels that astonished not only the Allies but also German intelligence. On the sea, shipyards along the East Coast churned out Liberty ships at a pace previously thought impossible. What once took a year now took weeks, each vessel capable of transporting troops, tanks, and supplies across the Atlantic. These ships became the lifeline of the Allied forces, enabling massive landings in North Africa, Sicily, and later Normandy. Manpower was another multiplier. Millions of men and women entered factories, shipyards, and training camps. Women, previously excluded from heavy industry, became the backbone of assembly lines. The iconic Rosie the Riveter, representing a labor force that would shift the tide of history. The Germans, observing from afar, underestimated both the scale and speed of the American war economy. Reports filtered back to Berlin describing endless columns of trucks, tanks, and aircraft arriving in ports and depots. Yet the mindset of the high command remained steeped in traditional European war thinking: quality over quantity, perfection over pragmatism. This belief would cost them dearly. The Sherman tank, emblematic of the American approach, was the perfect storm of pragmatism and mass production. Weighing just over 30 tons with a 75mm gun, it could not match a Tiger or Panther in armor or firepower. But the Americans didn't rely on single machines. They relied on hundreds, then thousands. Overwhelming German formations through numbers and coordination. In North Africa, the desert became the first proving ground. American and British units faced well-trained German panzer divisions. Initial encounters were costly. The Sherman was vulnerable to 88mm anti-tank guns. But where one tank fell, another arrived within days, sometimes dozens more thanks to assembly lines back home. The Desert War illustrated a critical lesson. Sustainable production could replace battlefield losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Meanwhile, Germany's factories faced constant disruption. Allied bombing raids over Hamburg, Essen, and the Ruhr reduced output, forced relocations, and caused shortages of steel, fuel, and components. The more Germany tried to build better tanks, the slower they produced them. The Americans, by contrast, embraced scale and simplicity. Each Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and produced in overwhelming numbers. By late 1943, the writing was clear on every battlefield. German commanders began reporting that American tanks simply kept coming. Every attack that destroyed a few Shermans met reinforcements within days. What had once seemed an advantage, superior individual machines, became irrelevant against a force built on sheer industrial might. In essence, World War II was becoming a battle not only of weapons but of factories, pipelines, and assembly lines. Steel and aluminum, oil and rubber, human ingenuity and labor. These were the invisible armies shaping victories long before a single tank crossed a desert or a bomb fell over a city. And from this industrial crucible, a lesson emerged. War is ultimately won by those who can outproduce, outlast, and outthink the enemy before bullets are fired. The stage was now set. On the battlefields of Europe, in the skies over Germany, and in the deserts of North Africa, the consequences of America's industrial surge would become undeniable. As German officers would soon realize, their war machine was being eclipsed not by tactics, but by tanks, built faster than they could dream. On the front lines, soldiers felt the difference almost immediately. A single Sherman might not survive a direct hit from a German Tiger, but where one fell, 10 more often took its place. Infantrymen learned to fight alongside these tanks with confidence, knowing reinforcements were never far behind. The morale boost was subtle but profound. The Americans could absorb losses that would have shattered smaller armies. Tank crews themselves faced peril daily. The roar of engines, the metallic scent of fuel, and the vibrations of traversing rough terrain were constant reminders of the stakes. Yet, they also understood that behind every steel hull stood a vast network of workers, engineers, and logisticians ensuring their survival. Letters home spoke not only of fear and exhaustion, but of awe at the sheer scale of American production, a confidence born from knowing that failure on one day would not mean defeat in the campaign. In contrast, German crews grew wary. Reports from panzer divisions noted the psychological strain, an enemy that never seemed to tire, never seemed to run out of men or machines. Veterans later recounted the feeling of facing waves of Shermans, tanks that arrived in numbers far beyond expectation, reinforcing the impression that the Allies were not just fighting, but flooding the battlefield with industry incarnate. Tactically, American forces embraced flexibility over brute superiority. Sherman units were dispersed across multiple fronts integrated with infantry, artillery, and air support. This decentralized approach allowed rapid exploitation of weak points in German lines, often forcing enemy commanders into reactive positions. Supply chains became as important as strategy. Every push into enemy territory relied on trucks, depots, and forward repair units. American planners understood that a tank's effectiveness was not measured solely in armor or firepower, but in its ability to remain operational over weeks and months. German commanders accustomed to relying on fewer, more powerful vehicles struggled to counter this flood of medium tanks that never seemed to stop arriving. In North Africa, Shermans proved their value by sheer persistence. Even when outgunned individually, they overwhelmed German panzers through coordinated assaults. Artillery engineers and tactical ingenuity complemented mass production, turning what might have been a defensive advantage into a decisive offensive tool. By mid-1943, German officers openly acknowledged that American tactical doctrine had adapted to exploit industrial superiority as a weapon. Technology alone did not win the war, but it amplified production's impact. The Sherman tank, for instance, incorporated standardized parts and modular design, allowing rapid repair and maintenance in the field. This meant that even damaged vehicles could return to combat far faster than the German panzers, whose complexity slowed repairs. Air power reinforced these advantages. Bombers like the B-17 and B-24 could destroy key German factories, ensuring that replacement Tigers and Panthers arrived too late or in insufficient numbers. American engineers focused not on building the perfect machine, but on building enough machines, tanks, planes, and trucks to overwhelm any tactical advantage held by the enemy. Radar, cryptography, and logistics technology worked in tandem with production. Convoys were tracked, supply lines optimized, and aircraft coordinated to protect ground advances. German forces found themselves reacting not only to the tanks they faced in combat, but to the invisible machinery behind them, the systems, factories, and technologies ensuring that for every Sherman lost, 5 more would appear. This combination of human endurance, tactical ingenuity, and technological pragmatism created a force multiplier that Germany could not match. The battlefield became a stage where industrial capacity manifested as raw military power, altering perceptions of what was possible in modern warfare. The consequences of these angles would soon culminate in decisive clashes across multiple theaters. German commanders initially underestimated the scale and speed of American production. Reports from the Eastern and Western fronts frequently described Allied medium tanks as numerous but individually weak, a belief rooted in experiences with earlier, less coordinated assaults. Yet as the war progressed, reality contradicted these assumptions. The Wehrmacht observed waves of Sherman tanks arriving faster than they could be destroyed. Frontline intelligence noted that lost units were often replaced within days, undermining the impact of tactical victories. The psychological effect on German troops was tangible. Officers recorded growing frustration, the feeling of fighting an enemy who never seemed to tire or run out of machines. German planners attempted to compensate by concentrating elite units, such as Tiger and Panther divisions, against Shermans. But the disparity in numbers made such measures only partially effective. Even the most formidable German tanks were overwhelmed by coordinated assaults, attrition, and the relentless arrival of reinforcements. By 1944, senior German officers admitted in diaries and post-war interrogations that American production was a decisive strategic factor, eroding their ability to achieve operational surprise. The scale of American production carried moral weight alongside its strategic significance. Each Sherman tank represented not only steel and machinery, but the labor, sacrifice, and ingenuity of thousands of civilians on the home front. Factories ran day and night. Women and men worked in unison to ensure the army had the tools to survive and advance. Strategically, this abundance allowed American commanders to experiment with new tactics, absorb losses, and maintain pressure across multiple fronts. It forced the Germans into a reactive stance, spreading their resources thin to counter a foe whose strength was as much in industry as in individual units. Operational decisions increasingly had to account for the reality that every destroyed Sherman could be replaced multiple times over, while German losses were permanent and irreplaceable. Moral dilemmas accompanied this strategy. Civilians in occupied territories bore the brunt of prolonged conflict, and high-intensity campaigns inevitably resulted in collateral damage. Yet American planners and soldiers understood that overwhelming industrial superiority could shorten the war's duration, ultimately saving lives by bringing Germany closer to defeat sooner. The American approach redefined modern warfare. Where previous conflicts emphasized elite units and concentrated firepower, the U.S. leveraged scale, speed, and adaptability. Tanks, aircraft, and artillery became interchangeable elements of a broader system, a network of production, logistics, and battlefield application. This evolution extended beyond technology to doctrine. Commanders coordinated assaults across multiple theaters, synchronized air and land operations, and relied on intelligence to maximize impact. The Germans, constrained by limited production capacity and rigid hierarchical command, could not match this level of integration. What had begun as a numerical advantage became an operational and psychological weapon. Every campaign, from North Africa to Normandy, showcased the fruits of this strategy. American forces could trade space for time, absorb enemy offensives, and launch counterattacks with a confidence born of sheer industrial might. In this environment, production itself became a decisive battlefield actor, shaping outcomes even before the first shells were fired. By combining the human experience, tactical adaptation, technological innovation, enemy reaction, and strategic evolution, the U.S. transformed the very nature of combat. The stage was set for climactic engagements where numbers, coordination, and industrial power would converge to tip the scales irreversibly. January 1944, the Italian front and the first major test of production might. The early morning sun rose over the Apennine Mountains, casting long shadows across the narrow valleys. Allied engineers laboring under frost and mud prepared the roads for the approaching armor columns. Every inch of terrain mattered. Every bridge, every incline could halt progress. From the air, squadrons of B-25s and P-47 Thunderbolts scouted ahead, signaling troop positions and enemy fortifications. The Germans, entrenched along the Gustav Line, had prepared extensively for such an assault. Minefields, anti-tank ditches, and reinforced bunkers dotted the landscape. Yet, what distinguished this attack from prior campaigns was not the bravery of soldiers or the cunning of commanders alone. It was the sheer scale of material support. Sherman tanks rolled forward in waves, each unit replaced and reinforced almost automatically from the rear. For every tank destroyed by German 80 diameter guns, 2 more emerged from the misty hills behind. The Wehrmacht's initial reaction was disbelief. Colonel Kurt Meyer, in his war diaries, noted the overwhelming impression. The Americans bring metal as if it were water. No matter how many we destroy, more come, forming lines that cannot be broken. Artillery barrages from American units softened the defenses while engineers cleared paths through minefields. Infantry advanced in coordinated waves, supported by tanks and artillery, each element of the attack backed by the industrial machine hundreds of miles away. By mid-morning, the first fortified German positions were overrun. Bunkers once thought impregnable fell to a combination of armor and firepower. Even elite panzer divisions found themselves outnumbered and overextended, forced to pull back to secondary lines. The battlefield had become a physical manifestation of American production, inexhaustible, relentless, and precise. June 6, 1944, D-Day, Normandy landings. The beaches of Normandy were a mosaic of chaos, steel, and courage. As dawn broke, the horizon was filled with ships and landing craft, disgorging thousands of troops under withering fire. The first waves of American and Allied infantry scrambled up the sands, dodging machine gun fire and artillery shells. Behind them, columns of Sherman tanks advanced across the beach exits, providing mobile cover and suppressing fortified positions. Their numbers were staggering. Losses were quickly replaced by reserves already landing from the next flotilla. For German commanders, the scene was disorienting. Intelligence had underestimated the scale of the invasion force, but the speed and volume of armored reinforcement stunned even the most experienced officers. Generals Erwin Rommel and Gerd von Rundstedt recognized immediately that conventional tactics could not stem this tide. The Allies had brought not just men, but an entire production-backed army capable of sustaining casualties that would have crippled previous campaigns. By the afternoon, the Allies had secured several beachheads, while the fighting would continue for weeks. The turning point was clear. The industrial-backed offensive could absorb losses, maintain pressure, and achieve objectives that no single commander could resist. Eastern and Western theaters converge across Europe. The Germans faced similar realities. In Italy, Normandy, and the Ardennes, production-fueled offensives continually stretched their forces. Every counterattack risked meeting an army that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The psychological effect was equally critical. Troops on the front lines began to question the inevitability of German victory. Diaries and letters from the period describe a growing sense of inevitability surrounding Allied advances, driven less by tactics than by the realization that material superiority could not be matched. This convergence of manpower, mechanization, and production created a decisive shift. Battles were no longer isolated tactical engagements. They became strategic demonstrations of industrial might. American factories thousands of miles away had become as lethal as artillery or armor on the front lines. Late 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, production meets desperation. December brought snow and ice to the Ardennes forest. German forces, seeking to split the Allied front, launched a surprise offensive. The forests echoed with the rumble of tanks and the crack of artillery. Panzer columns moved like ghosts through frozen roads, targeting supply lines and towns. Yet the Allies had anticipated the limits of German capability. Each time a Sherman or M4 tank was destroyed, replacement units rolled off trucks and trailers with astonishing speed. Air support strafed advancing columns, and newly arrived troops filled gaps before the enemy could exploit them. The German attack, though tactically bold, found itself countered not just by men, but by the relentless replenishment of material and machinery. Commanders reported that for every vehicle destroyed, several more seemed to appear in its place. Morale, already strained, faltered further under the knowledge that industrial power was an invisible but omnipresent ally. Pacific theater, island hopping, fueled by production, while Europe burned with armored engagements, the Pacific witnessed a different demonstration of the same principle. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps advanced island by island. Each amphibious assault required ships, landing craft, vehicles, artillery, and aircraft, all coordinated across thousands of miles of ocean. The capture of Saipan in June 1944 illustrated the scale of production superiority. For every plane lost to Japanese anti-aircraft fire, replacements from American factories were already en route. Tanks and amphibious vehicles landed in waves, supporting infantry assaults with relentless pressure. Japanese commanders recorded their astonishment. They strike again and again, and yet their strength never diminishes. Every loss is replaced, as if the ocean itself bears them forward. Victory was achieved not through a single decisive engagement, but through continuous, overwhelming material support, enabled by the United States' unmatched industrial output. The final months, Germany crumbles. Under the weight of production, by early 1945, German forces were retreating on nearly all fronts. The Western Allies advanced from Normandy through France into Germany, while the Soviets pressed from the east. Strategic bombing campaigns had destroyed railways, factories, and supply depots. But even more critical was the continuous flow of American weapons, tanks, trucks, and munitions reaching forward units. Field reports from German officers reflect a stark realization. We are outnumbered in men, and worse, outnumbered in steel. Each day, the Americans bring forth new machines of war, and we cannot stop them. Cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, and Dresden bore the scars of relentless aerial bombardment. But behind the front lines, American factories churned tirelessly. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft arrived in such quantity that losses could no longer dictate pace. The offensive never paused, never weakened. The turning point defined by industry, the decisive factor of late 1944 and early 1945 was not a single battle, not a single hero or strategy, but the cumulative power of industrial might. America's ability to outproduce, replace, and reinforce created a strategic tempo that Germany could neither match nor counter. Every Sherman that rolled onto the battlefield, every plane that roared through the skies, every shell fired in relentless barrages, each represented not only a tactical advantage but a psychological one. German soldiers began to understand the futility of resistance in numerical terms. For every loss they inflicted, the Allies could absorb it tenfold. Commanders across Europe and the Pacific alike recognized a fundamental truth. Victory belonged to the side that could maintain production and supply at unprecedented scale. The weapons of war were no longer limited by the front lines. They extended back into the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle. Europe, the crushing weight of industrial supremacy. By May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Cities were leveled, rail networks shattered, and entire regions depopulated. Yet it was not just the devastation from bombs and bullets that defined the outcome. It was the relentless production that never allowed German forces to regain momentum. American factories had produced over 88,000 aircraft, more than 120,000 vehicles, and over 2.5 million rifles during the war. Each Sherman tank, each B-17 bomber, each artillery shell represented a force multiplier far beyond the enemy's capacity. For German officers, this was a bitter revelation. Tactical skill could not overcome the numerical and logistical superiority of American output. Reports from captured German generals illustrate this despair. We fought valiantly, but for every tank we destroyed, 5 more appeared. Our strategy was irrelevant against such inexhaustible strength. The Western Allies' advance was methodical. Cities like Aachen, Cologne, and Nuremberg fell not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because they were consistently outnumbered and outsupplied. Strategic bombing campaigns weakened infrastructure, but even as rail lines were destroyed, the sheer volume of American resources ensured that frontline units remained reinforced, fueled, and equipped. Pacific Theater. Island hopping secures victory. The story in the Pacific mirrored Europe in a striking way. Japan, isolated and resource-limited, struggled to match American industrial output. U.S. forces captured island after island, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, using overwhelming numbers of ships, landing craft, tanks, and aircraft. Each assault showcased the principle of industrial dominance as a force multiplier. Japanese commanders repeatedly noted their surprise. No matter how many ships we sink, they keep coming. Each landing is supported by more tanks, more artillery, more men. It is endless. The relentless tide of equipment and reinforcements allowed American commanders to maintain pressure without pause. Losses, inevitable in the harsh Pacific combat, were absorbed seamlessly. The Battle of Saipan alone highlighted the disparity. For every plane and tank lost, replacements were already en route from the United States. The psychological and strategic consequences, the impact of production superiority, extended beyond the physical battlefield. Morale among German troops fell as they witnessed an enemy that never seemed to run out of strength. Entire units faced exhaustion and defeat not from a single engagement, but from the cumulative effect of being constantly overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Strategically, this allowed Allied planners to dictate tempo. Operations could be launched at will, reinforced quickly, and sustained indefinitely. German and Japanese high commands were left reacting, improvising defenses, redeploying stretched forces, and ultimately, facing the inevitability of defeat. Even after the war, historians recognized the decisive role of American production. It was not only the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of generals, it was the output of factories, the rhythm of assembly lines, and the depth of industrial planning that turned the tide of the war. Samuel Eliot Morison, History of United States Naval Operations in World War II. Numbers that drove victory. By the end of 1944, the scale of American production was staggering. Consider these figures. Tanks. The U.S. built over 88,000 tanks during the war, outproducing Germany's total output for the entire conflict. Aircraft. Over 300,000 military aircraft rolled off American assembly lines, dwarfing Axis air production. Naval vessels. More than 3,000 warships from carriers to destroyers were commissioned, allowing simultaneous campaigns in both the Atlantic and Pacific. Ammunition. Millions of artillery shells, small arms rounds, and bombs kept frontline troops equipped and aggressive. For Axis planners, these numbers were incomprehensible. Even their most optimistic assessments failed to account for the U.S.'s ability to replace losses faster than battles could destroy them. Where German and Japanese factories required months to recover lost capacity, American industry produced in weeks. Strategic implications, the domino effect. The industrial advantage created a cascading effect across all theaters of war. Europe, Allied forces could launch simultaneous offensives, Normandy, Operation Market Garden, and the push into the Rhineland, without risking a depletion of resources. Pacific island hopping campaigns succeeded because reinforcements, ships, and aircraft were always available. Losses were temporary setbacks rather than crippling blows. Morale and diplomacy. Knowing that enemy forces could not match production drained morale in Axis troops and bolstered confidence among Allied soldiers and civilians. Governments aligned with the Allies also realized the futility of resistance, accelerating surrenders. American generals repeatedly emphasized this principle. Victories were rarely achieved solely through tactics or bravery. Industrial scale enabled strategy to be executed flawlessly and continuously. Post-war lessons and lasting impact. The war's aftermath highlighted how industrial capacity became a central determinant of modern conflict. Countries could no longer rely solely on strategy or technology in isolation. Production was a weapon in itself. Military academies worldwide studied American output as a model of total war efficiency. Leaders recognized that the U.S. not only fought on battlefields but also in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines. Industrial supremacy provided flexibility, endurance, and decisiveness, qualities that could win wars before soldiers even engaged the enemy. Germany and Japan's defeat underscored this lesson. Their best generals, advanced tactics, and fierce soldiers were unable to overcome a force multiplied exponentially by machinery and manpower. Production turned attrition into an unsustainable trap for the Axis powers. The tangible consequences of industrial power shaped not only the conclusion of World War II but the way nations approached warfare thereafter. The ability to outproduce, sustain, and replace became as crucial as strategic genius or battlefield heroism. As we move to reflect on the larger meaning of this supremacy, we see how the machinery of industry became inseparable from the human story of courage, sacrifice, and innovation. War is often measured in battles won, cities captured, or enemies defeated. Yet the story of World War II reminds us that victory can also be measured in factories humming, assembly lines running, and raw steel transformed into instruments of survival. The United States' industrial output did not just support its soldiers. It shaped the very strategy of the war. It allowed generals to plan offensives with confidence, knowing that losses could be replenished. It allowed pilots, tank crews, and sailors to fight without the paralyzing fear of shortages. The human cost of this industrial might was immense, yet inseparable from its impact. Every tank rolled off the line represented not just metal, but the hands, skills, and sacrifices of thousands of civilians and workers. Every bomber, every shell, every ship was a testament to collective effort, the intersection of human ingenuity and relentless labor. The machinery alone could not win. It was the people behind it who transformed production into power. Strategically, the lesson of this era endures. Modern warfare is as much about sustaining resources and innovation as it is about courage on the battlefield. The ability to anticipate, outproduce, and adapt often outweighs numerical parity in men or materiel. Germany and Japan, despite their tactical brilliance, could not overcome an opponent whose industrial base was as vast as its ambition. In reflection, the story of America's factories is also the story of the human spirit. It is a reminder that victory in war is never accidental, but the sum of preparation, intelligence, sacrifice, and unyielding determination. It also serves as a cautionary tale. In any conflict, Neglecting the infrastructure of war can be as fatal as underestimating the enemy's strategy. As the guns fell silent and the world rebuilt, the legacy of industrial supremacy remained clear. It reshaped warfare, altered global power structures, and proved that in modern conflict, victory belongs not only to the bravest on the front lines, but also to the countless unseen hands that fuel the fight.